It was Friday. My friend Jackson had invited me to go fishing. We sometimes go to quiet, rather remote places to be alone with nature. We've known each other since university. We're family friends now. Both of us not new to camping and outdoor survival. Not that we were professional hikers, but we hiked. Jack, as I called him, read on one of the local forums about some small lake which is surrounded on all sides by dense forest. For many kilometers in the area, there are no villages or other settlements. The place wasn't very popular because it was hard to get to when there were enough other fishing lakes in the area. But it had been a long time since we'd been camping, and Jack decided it was perfect. We reached the place, almost according to the plan, but it took us a long time to find the right turn on the dirt road. Then we wandered a bit through the forest and came to the lake when the last sunset rays were already fading on its surface. All we had time to do before dark was set up the tent and lay out our gear. As the sun set, the sky became cloudy and it started to rain, so we decided not to make a fire, but to have a quick dinner. No cooking required, and go to bed. After eating a couple of sandwiches, we crawled into the tent, wrapped ourselves in sleeping bags, and fell asleep to the measured sound of drizzling rain. I woke up to my friend getting out of his sleeping bag and climbing through me to the exit of the tent. He got out safely, but he forgot to close the entrance behind him, and the cool night air and dampness from the lake entered the tent. I was too lazy to get out of my sleeping bag to close the entrance, so I decided to wait for my friend to return. I lay like that for about 20 minutes, but he didn't come back. It was starting to get light, and I figured Jack had just decided to build a fire and start making breakfast. I crawled out of the tent to confirm my assumptions, since I'd have to get up soon anyway. When I got outside, I didn't realize what was going on at first. Jack was facing the woods with his arms down along his torso. I called his name again, but he didn't respond, so I went over to him and spoke. "Have you fallen asleep here?" I walked around my friend and saw that his eyes were closed. Jack hadn't sleepwalked before, so I was surprised by what I saw. I walked around him once more, waved my hand in front of his closed eyes, and waited for no reaction from his side. I didn't know what to do with a man in that state, so I just stood next to him and, trying to think of something, looked where Jack would have looked if his eyes had been open, which was into the woods, and what I saw was something I often have nightmares about. At first, all I noticed was some movement between the trees, but as I looked closer, I realized that there were people walking between the trees. They were all either naked or wearing loincloths. They had nothing in their hands, and they seemed to pay no attention to us. But the more I looked, the less real it all seemed. Some people went from tree to tree in spurts. Some reached a tree, stood behind it for a long time, then walked back, all in silence. It was as if I had crossed some invisible line and didn't even have time to shout anything. The words stuck in my throat. All the people walking haphazardly between the trees had stopped and were now looking straight at me. All of this was happening in the complete silence that only happens in the forest in the summer before dawn. Their behavior lasted no more than a minute, and then they moved out of the woods in a continuous column toward Jack and me. I turned, prepared to run, and even grabbed my friend's sleeve to drag him along, but was stunned to see the same men standing on the bank and around our tent, all in the mud, and none of them making a sound. The people from the forest surrounded us, but they didn't dare to come closer. Anyway, they started walking around us without any formation. Only now, around me, holding my sleeping friend by the sleeve, Jack turned to me, and I rejoiced. But when I looked at his face, I realized it was premature. His eyes were still closed, I let go of the sleeve of his jacket and stepped back. He knocked me out with a quick, crisp punch. I didn't even realize it, and I couldn't have expected anything like that from a sleeping man. I woke up on the same shore, the sun blinding my eyes, my head throbbing mercilessly. I remembered the events of this morning and was horrified, but looking around quickly, I saw only a tent and no half-naked people. That cheered me up a little. At least we hadn't fallen into the clutches of some sect that lived secluded in the forest. I stood up and walked uncertainly toward the tent, dizzy and nauseous. When I got to the tent, I saw Jack asleep, wrapped up in his sleeping bag. I decided not to wake him up and went to the river, washed up, built a fire, and started cooking breakfast. When breakfast was ready, I went to the tent again, looked inside, and shouted happily, "Wake up, Tyson. Breakfast is ready. Wake up, Tyson. Breakfast is ready." I decided that this nickname should now stick with Jack, for he had knocked me out with real skill. But there was no response from him, so I climbed into the tent and started waking my friend through the sleeping bag. But then I noticed that from under the sleeping bag there were some dark, wet spots. Not understanding anything, I carefully unzipped the zipper and saw that my friend had a sharp stick sticking out of his belly. With a jerk, I jumped out of the tent and crawled a few meters away from it. I was in a panic. I didn't know what to do. There were no words to describe my condition, and probably none at all. I forced myself to go back into the tent and feel for a pulse, but it was useless. My friend was dead and already beginning to freeze. Then I had a kind of nervous breakdown. I jumped to my feet and ran. I ran for a long time. Now I remember it and realize that I made a couple of loops through the woods. But at that time, I didn't care. I ran, fell when I couldn't run anymore, walked, then walked, then walked, almost falling, and didn't realize why I was doing it. Only when I found our abandoned car, I fell down next to its wheel and sobbed. I sobbed for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe two. I didn't come to my senses until deep in the night. Then I called the police and an ambulance. I wasn't afraid, and it somehow didn't occur to me that I might be accused of murder. Anyway, that's how it turned out. I was called in for questioning many times, but then for some reason, they decided to believe me. In the end, they wrote it all off as an accident. I was advised to consult a psychologist because the police found no traces of people either on the shore or in the forest and wrote everything off as something I dreamt in the pre-dawn gloom, and the rest I made up or hallucinated. It was very hard for me to go through everything that happened. I thought about it a lot, but to this day, I have no answers to the questions. Who were those silent people? Why did they do that to my friend? And why didn't they touch me? So it will remain a mystery to me for the rest of my life.